Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Brad Jensen. I'm a professor at the McDonough School of Business at Georgetown University, and on behalf of the Georgetown Center for Business and Public Policy, I would like to welcome you to our event on TPP today. Just one word on the Georgetown Center before we start. The Georgetown Center for Business and Public Policy its purpose is to stimulate conversation at the nexus of business and public policy. We host events like this where we bring together scholars. Today, our panel is representative by people's history in terms of business and government and the research community. Bring together scholars, business people, and government officials to discuss issues at the nexus of business and public policy. We, Bob Vastine and I, organize the trade policy discussions, which occur just about monthly. The Georgetown Center also hosts events on other issues covering innovation, energy, environment, and telecommunications. If you're interested in these topic areas, I encourage you to visit the Georgetown Center website. In addition, if you're interested in Twitter, I'm old, so I don't know anything about that. You can see the hashtag on the screen. So this is an exciting time to discuss the Trans-Pacific Partnership. It's exciting because it's a huge mega-regional deal. Still, where it's kind of a cliffhanger as to whether we will bring this to a close this week or not. And then I think it's also exciting because there's likely to be a big fight over TPP once it's done. So for many reasons, it's exciting. So we have brought together an eminent and distinguished panel to provide a variety of perspectives on the Trans-Pacific Partnership. To my immediate left is Gary Hufbauer. Gary is Reginald Jones Senior Fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Gary was previously at the Council on Foreign Relations, Georgetown University, and the Treasury Department. At the far end is Dan Ikenson. Dan is the director of the Cato Institute's Herbert Stiefel Center for Trade Policy Studies. Dan is an acknowledged expert on trade policy and has worked previously in a number of private sector roles in consulting, business advisory, and in law. And then in the middle is my colleague Bob Vastine. Bob is Senior Industry Fellow at the Georgetown Center for Business and Public Policy. Prior to joining Georgetown, Bob served as the president of the Coalition of Service Industries, and Bob has worked both in the Treasury Department and here on Capitol Hill. For full backgrounds on peoples, I encourage you to refer to the sheet that was handed out for everyone's bios. So I think I'll turn now to my colleague Bob to give us some framing remarks on TPP, and then we'll go with Dan, and then Gary to wrap up, and then in a time frame to ensure that we have plenty of time for Q&A. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much. This is an opportunity for me to begin to develop a theme that I really believe in, and that is that we are at the end of the period when the WTO was the major trade negotiating forum, and that the TPP is the new WTO. Obviously, and one of the most important trade negotiations we have ever. It's hard to compare with the Uruguay round, but certainly exceptionally important in its scope and the concerns that it attempts to address. I've just come back from the reading room. 700 some pages. It is massive, 227 odd chapters. It is a very complicated agreement, and the issues are most complex, and all you have to do is read Mr. Levin's analysis of that last week and Lori Wallach's, and you see that there's a tremendous amount of dissension about the meaning of many of the provisions that have been negotiated, even though they are not available, really, and not understood completely. So there is a tremendous amount of confusion, really, about this agreement, what it can do, what it might not do. And we really have to wait until we see it. But so much furor has been generated No, that it's really sort of difficult to see the path of light. There is a very good outcome here, potentially, an extremely powerful outcome for the United States and others. I hope very much, and I know many of you do, that this can be completed. TPP was gestated by a group of 4 tiny countries, New Zealand, Singapore, Brunei, Chile, called the Trans-Pacific Strategic Economic Partnership. The U.S. caught this at the moment, understood. Somebody in our government, maybe Barbara Wiesel, somebody understood that this was the germ of a really important new agreement. And the United States shouldered its way into this very small negotiation and brought along a group of other countries, 9 total, and then guess what? Canada and Mexico and Japan had to participate, and they literally shouldered their way in. They made it impossible for us to keep them out, and they brought with them a lot of complications, just as we had predicted. Just as we had said, we really don't want you here because, you bring with you dairy and autos and things like that. And so we tried to extract promises from them at the outset that they would be compliant, and of course they haven't been. So, surprise. So now we have 12 countries. I think that if successful, the TPP will coalesce a group of countries that can power the Pacific Rim economy and lead to an even wider group of countries, perhaps to the infamous FTAP, the Free Trade Area of the Asia Pacific. Why not dream? Anyway, it would be a phenomenal step towards such an agreement, a coalescence of economies. The TPP is not directed at China. That was not our purpose, but certainly it has really important implications for our trade relations with China. Having a large block of its neighbors trading by the same rules right next door has got to be influential on them. The TPP leaves Europe confounded. They simply don't know what to do about it. They are unable to muscle up to the demands that we have made of them in the transatlantic partnership. Squirrely is one word I would use for them. Certainly in the services area, they have been very difficult, very slow to come forth to try to realize the dream of a great partnership amongst 2 highly sophisticated economies that understand the need to join up, to take advantage of their joint economic power. In the meantime, my favorite organization, the World Trade Organization, where I spent many years working absolutely uselessly to try to get them to deal with services trade, the WTO struggles to close the Doha round. Remember that? With a minimalist package that could be seen to be a closure. The Doha round needs a stake in its heart. It needs to go away. And particularly since it doesn't include any services. In the meantime, services, 67% of the world economy, depends on who you ask, has gone its own way with its own negotiation called the TISA, the Trade and Services Agreement. So the bottom line here is that WTO sort of standing aside, useful, great dispute settlement, nice people, great place to go to the Perle du Lac and have lunch. But I think the network of agreements that we have put in place under the leadership of Ambassador Froman and predecessors will leave the U.S. front and center in the global economy, that the confluence of these agreements will leave the U.S. very well positioned in our competition with China and others in the next decades.
Great, thanks, Bob. Dan?
Thank you. Thanks. Is this on?
There we go. Thank you for the invitation to participate, Brad and Bob. I was asked to share a few thoughts about, positive thoughts about the TPP, and maybe to express some concerns. So I'm not going to really get into the details of what's going on within the negotiations because I'm really not all that privy to it. So let me start by saying it's been a great year for trade. It's been very topical. I've been in Cato for 15 years, and I don't recall as much discussion about trade. TPA happened. TPP has made some great progress. It's good to see that negotiators have stayed steadfast and committed to the objective. It's good to see that governments remain committed to trade liberalization. That's a good thing. And it's good also to see the United States leading a multinational effort that actually might succeed. It's been a while, and I'm talking about on many fronts. I was originally very skeptical of the president's commitment to the TPP when he announced it. After all, the formal announcement came in, I think, December of 2009. At the time, we had 3 bilateral agreements that had been negotiated and concluded that were put onto the shelf. And it seemed to me to be sort of a diversion. And, why are we interested in this very smallish agreement when we have these other things that we've negotiated? My colleague Sally James wrote a paper at the time, is the TPP worth the fuss? And pointing out that there's not much to be had there. It's changed. Certainly it needed Japan to join, and that was a great addition. It makes it much more economically meaningful. Still, I think that the marginal benefits of a successful TPP are, at least in the short run, are smaller than the marginal costs of failure. I mean, I think it's very important to get this done for the sake of getting it done. And I know that's not a perspective shared with everybody, but the benefits to the 12 countries involved. These 12 countries account for a third of global trade, almost half of global GDP. But the benefits to businesses and consumers and taxpayers in those countries, it's not all that huge. But on the other hand, the importance of TPP to countries that are outside of it is very big. I think it motivates Korea to want to join, accede to the final deal, Taiwan and others. And the good news here is that TPP has motivated other governments to engage in important reforms. I think we've seen some reforms happening in China and in India and other places. So in that sense, it was necessary to replace the Doha round. And I've been calling for a stake through the heart for a long time in Doha, but it was important to have some, not a carrot, the rabbit at the end at the horse races or the dog races, the Swifty. You needed to have that out in front as motivation. One thing that I'm really looking forward to if we conclude the TPP now or next month is that we'll finally be able to refute some of the scaremongering we've been hearing. When the text is available, public will be able to tell Lori Wallach, no, TPP does not cause cancer. No, so I'm looking forward to that for sure.
She won't believe you.
No. She'll have her own facts. No. So I'll say this: I've been critical of the president's efforts and enthusiasm to message properly here domestically, and I still have a bit of a problem with that. I think he did a good enough job to allow his trade negotiators to work very hard, but his domestic messaging has not been good. It's been very defensive. Why should the United States engage in trade and globalization? Because if not, the Chinese are going to write the rules. If not, globalization is going to pass us by. It endorses all of the stereotypes, all the negative stereotypes that people have about trade. His State of the Union address, an opportunity with Republicans seeming willing to give him trade promotion authority to make a real affirmative case, and he just really hasn't done that yet. And at the beginning of his term, we wrote a paper called Audaciously Hopeful, How President Obama Can Restore the Pro-Trade Consensus. And I think that's important. But for the past, since the Bush-Gore election, I think trade has been exceptionally partisan, and it's all been about winning the issue or getting the agreement through, as opposed to demonstrating that trade is actually a positive thing for everybody. There's too much politics. Hillary Clinton, I think, she was an architect of the TPP. She was an architect of the pivot to Asia. Yet doesn't totally disavow the TPP now, but she is being very cautious. Had she come out and endorsed it, then between Obama and Clinton, they could make a pretty strong case for trade, and it's a shame. There are plenty of good reasons for labor to embrace trade, for the interests that seem to oppose it to embrace it. Ted Alden from the CFR, Council on Foreign Relations, wrote a really good piece a few months ago, pointing out how labor really should have been involved in this process. It put itself out of the process by saying no, where it could have really shaped the terms, and that could have helped to bring more Democrats into the fold. The economic message that has not been laid out requires the president to focus on the sort of the geopolitical card to sell TPP. It is about China. The problem, and that will sell, and look, this isn't the first time that spokesman for trade agreements goes geopolitical. President Bush, to get the CAFTA through, I think on the eve of that vote, was here talking to Republicans in the Senate saying CAFTA is all about stopping Hugo Chavez. And Daniel Ortega just came back in Nicaragua. So there's a foreign policy dimension to trade, but we can't, selling this as an agreement that does not include China is dishonest, because we want China to be in it. The architects of this agreement ultimately want China to be in it. And whether it becomes a free trade area of the Asia Pacific, which I think ultimately would be the right way to go, I don't think China would join the TPP. I think China would want to call it something else, and we will see other countries get involved. I think that's a good objective, and we should be careful about demonizing China in this process too much. Just a few other points. The agreement is expected to include 30 chapters on traditional issues, market access issues, customs, border issues, but also issues that penetrate much more deeply into sort of domestic, what was once considered domestic regulatory space. So the TPP is, it's about intellectual property decisions and investor decisions and regulatory coherence. And as a result of that, it has inspired more interest in these trade agreements. Congressional committees that used to not have any real interest in trade are now pricking up their ears. Interest groups that are single issue groups, people are worried about adversely affecting the balance between intellectual property rights and the public interest with respect to copyrights and patents. They are animated by these kinds of things. People who are concerned about a foreign company being able to extract damages from the U.S. government because a policy adversely affected its assets by going through this ISDS channel. This is suggesting to me that there's going to be a much more rigorous debate about trade going forward, and that we need to have an honest discussion about it, rather than just trying to win. Let's explain why this is good and why it's problematic. I used to only get hate mail from the left about my support for trade, and then I started talking about China and saying our relationship is important, and I'd get hate mail from the economic nationalists on the right. But now, libertarians, fellow libertarians are saying, why can you support the TPP? That's not Adam Smith's trade. This is managed trade, and it's a governance agreement. And, it is to some extent, but there's also a lot of trade liberalization that is going to come out of this. So what we're doing at Cato is we're waiting to see the text, and we're going to evaluate it sort of chapter by chapter and score it. So this chapter we're going to have a scale of 0 to 10. We're not exactly sure how the methodology is going to work. But each chapter we're going to score. And I suspect that the final cumulative grade will be, thumbs up. But I think there may be some chapters that don't get the highest score. Maybe the IP chapter or the investment chapter. Certainly don't like the rules of origin with respect to textiles. It's shameful, I think, that we require foreign garment exporters to the United States to qualify for the benefits of the agreement. They need to use U.S. inputs. We've essentially exported our textile protectionism. We've been protecting that industry since 1790. Since one of the first acts of the first Congress was to put tariffs. Yeah, it's so. Where we're stuck this week, it seems, is this is a 21st century agreement, but it's a lot of market access issues that still need to be worked out, which is somewhat ironic. Why don't I just stop there and give more time for Q&A? Maybe I've already exceeded my 15 minutes, but thank you for your attention.
Thanks, Dan. Gary?
Well, Brad, thanks very much for inviting me, and I want to thank everybody for coming. You probably just came for the lunch, but hopefully this isn't too painful. Hope this isn't too painful. Dan used the word marginalization, and I want to just pick up on that. I don't disagree much with Dan, but I think this is really an important agreement in a couple of respects, or an important point in time. Firstly, if you look at the record of trade since the Great Recession, it's been quite disappointing. We are no longer growing trade faster than world GDP. In fact, it's just slightly slower, whereas the previous 50 years, since the late 40s up to, say, 2005 at least, trade grew about, on average, 2% faster than GDP, and was a big contributor to an enormous era of prosperity. Those are the best 50 years in recorded history. Recorded economic history really starts in about 1500. So in terms of growth, bringing people out of poverty and so forth, it was a great period. But this engine has slowed down, and a related engine also has slowed down, and that's foreign direct investment, international investment. The high number was in 2007 at 2.1 trillion globally, and now it's fallen. It's running at about 1.6 trillion now, and this is, 8 years later.
Inward or outward?
Pardon? Pardon?
Inward or outward?
No, this is, well, you could count all the inward or all the outward, and you get, in principle, the same number. About 2.2 trillion in the high year, now down to 1.6 trillion. So those are two, indicators of globalization, and they have distinctly slowed. Also, as Bob Vastine has mentioned and emphasized, the World Trade Organization has sputtered. Some people say, put it out of its misery, but in any event, it has sputtered as a negotiating forum. And in addition, if you look around the world, there's no major new liberalization except this agreement, and possibly over the corner, over the horizon, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. So in my view, this will be the defining point of whether policy liberalization goes forward or not. And it's also the defining point for really an important ideological battle where there are a good many people, and Bob Vastine mentioned the prominent ones in this city, Lori Wallach. He didn't mention Clyde Prestowitz, but Clyde is there, and then Congressman Levin is certainly not an enthusiast about globalization. He has a very nuanced memo out. There are a lot of people who feel that globalization has not been good for the United States, that it's, to take the extreme view, which we could identify with Lori Wallach, is that globalization makes the top 1% richer and makes everybody else poorer. That's only a little bit extreme from what she's saying. Well, I don't believe that. I believe it helps everyone, but I certainly recognize that this has been a difficult period for the middle class in America. And so, if you just take those two facts together, more globalization, difficult period for the middle class, and say cause and effect, that's the Lori Wallach story, which I think is quite misleading. But it's widely adopted in the United States. If you look at the Pew polls and other polls, trade is not, gets about 50%, depending on how the question is asked. So it's a big ideological battle here. It's also an ideological battle in Europe. Not so much an ideological battle in our Asian partners, and certainly not in either Mexico or Canada, which are quite in favor, in a general way, for more liberalization. Now, the only person in this panel who's read all 700 pages is Bob Vastine, and I'm sure he has a photographic memory, so if you have any really detailed questions, ask them to him.
I have a weak memory, and I didn't read every page.
Well, no, can't get off the hook that easily. And I suspect, I know that if you're working in Congress, you're totally overwhelmed and you have a very long week, and how much can you read? I'm just going to take my remaining minutes to point out some items which I think are maybe worth reading in the text. Now, of course, there are the big items that's been in the press of the biologics patent, not patent, but data exclusivity provision. There's the rule of origin in autos, and there are the dairy provisions. Those are the three hang-up items this week, which may or may not be resolved by tomorrow night. But apart from those items, which I think as time goes on, however they're resolved or not resolved, will kind of fade in significance. Here are some items which I think are going to be more significant over time. The dispute settlement provisions. These really, and I'm not a cleared advisor, so I haven't read this. This is really important. It is said that the provisions on labor will be much closer to the arbitration provisions or dispute settlement provisions on commercial subjects than in past free trade agreements, and likewise on the environment. But likewise, as was mentioned by both Dan and Bob, the investor state dispute settlement provisions, and they're the critical thing. We know that tobacco has been written out, that was in the paper, but the critical thing is what is the nuanced language for dealing with environmental, safety, and health regulations. I think anybody who's worked in any of those fields knows that, there's a proper scope for all those kind of regulations, but on the other hand, they can be used in a very protective way. You let me write the regulations, I can protect out anybody I want to protect out. And so there's always this balance, and how the balance is dealt with in the language in the TPP will be very interesting. But also on all the dispute settlement provisions, to what extent do private parties, companies, unions, have access to the dispute settlement provision? Remember, the old WTO system is that only governments can bring cases to the WTO, only governments. Now in ISDS, companies can bring cases against countries. What's going to be the formula here in terms of rights of action? Because if you have to go to your government to bring a case on an issue, you a company, well, if you are Apple, you're going to get the attention of the government. If you're some little firm in Maryland, which does $100 million of business, you're not going to get the attention. It's going to be a slog to get the attention on anything. So then, to what extent can you directly bring an action? That'll be a very important issue. Next issue, the conditions for evergreening this 700 pages. I mean, our typical way of dealing with free trade agreements, and also in the WTO, is that you write it, you get the text, you get it ratified by the members, and then it's frozen. That's been the story with NAFTA. It's also the story with the Peru FTA, CAFTA, you name it. It's kind of frozen in time, embalmed. And none of them have been any good at evergreening, that is updating. Now, the WTO, in principle, is supposed to be updated, but as Bob has said, we've had this Doha round since 2001, and now it's 2015, so 14 years with no success in updating. Well, what are the ways of updating? And new issues will come along, it's for sure. And some of the text may seem, inappropriate within 5 years' time. So that's one aspect. And the other aspect is, a very important aspect, is conditions for new members. Because if this is to be, the basis for integrating economies across the Pacific, you have to have provisions for new members. How difficult? You know, do all countries have to agree to open negotiation with the new members, or some majority? How does that work? That's very important, obviously, for Korea, just around the corner, but not too far off. Maybe the Philippines, Thailand, and maybe in the distant future some negotiation with China. Okay, next issue, which I don't think will be dealt with in a way I would like to see dealt with, but I'll be interested in reading the text. Sub-federal procurement. We have never liberalized in a meaningful way sub-federal procurement. And I've written about this. Cato's invited me to a conference on this issue, amongst other issues in the TTIP space. About 15% of GDP is sub-federal procurement here and in other advanced countries. And this is not really covered by open rules, and sub-federal procurement in many countries is, you know, it's an avenue for corruption. I don't think that's generally true in the U.S., but certainly is an avenue for favoritism, and it's an avenue for imposing more costs on you know, states and municipalities than they would have had if they had open competition. I don't think there's going to be much progress, but I might be pleasantly surprised. Next item that I think is worth looking at are the rules on state-owned enterprises. Now, we think of state-owned enterprises as something that the Chinese do and the Vietnamese, and maybe if we think about it, we realize that Singapore has a lot of state-owned enterprise. We don't think about it as something we do. We do a lot of it. There are a lot of state-owned enterprises. CalPERS, huge state-owned enterprise, billions of dollars. And the post office, pretty big item, Tennessee Valley Authority. Now, to what extent are the rules that we write, of course, we're trying to write it so that it covers Malaysia and, you know, Japan and so forth, but, you know, you write it for the other guy, it's going to be written for you. To what extent will this impact our state-owned enterprise as well as the others? And there are really, I think, two big issues here that are well worth, you know, paying a little attention as to the text. One is, to what extent will state-owned enterprises have to, you know, be in a full way transparent on their accounts? You know, who's running them, kind of subsidies they get, and so forth. The whole transparency issue. Most of them are run in a pretty invisible fashion. The second issue of great importance is procurement. Are they required, assuming they're federally owned, and, you know, there's a state-federal issue, but assuming they're federally owned, are they required to have open procurement? Does Amtrak actually does have pretty open procurement, but will it be required to have it in, you know, post office and so forth and so on? So those are two big issues there. I guess the final point I would make is going to go back to the big picture. I heard on the radio, NPR, the other day as I was driving along up to the University of Maryland, that in 2050, I think that was the terminal date, the population in the U.S. will be 450 million, and 80% of the increment will be Asian. I don't know if that's true. I haven't looked at the demography, but it was an arresting statistic. We're now about 330 million. So if that's true, you know, I mean, this is a U.S. and other Western Pacific country, or, you know, our side of the Pacific joining the other side of the Pacific. And so, I mean, I think in a symbolic way, if it's rejected, especially if it's rejected by the Congress, you know, that says something to Asia, says something of very considerable importance. Now, one final comment I might make, a bit of an advertisement. We've put out a lot of numbers on what this, you know, the immediate payoff of this is in terms of exports, imports, and I think imports are good as well as exports, and income, GDP that can be generated by this, and they're on our website. What we use is the computable general equilibrium type of model, which takes a lot of mathematical expertise to run these things. But at the bottom line, they're guesses. And what I would say is that the data that we put in, or that has been put in by our modelers, will not change whatever the 700 pages have, because they're not at that level of detail. the way these models work, it's kind of a broad assumption about how much tariffs fall and how much services get liberalized, and then you run it. But you can't run, for example, we don't have the tools for saying, what's the effect of biologic data exclusivity of 8 years versus 7 years? Thanks very much.
Thank you all. That was very informative, and I'm sure our audience has questions. Yes, please identify yourself and then ask your question.
My name is Stanley Nolan. I'm at Georgetown Business School, like Brett is. So none of you guys care much for WTO at least anymore. But it is the world, W for World Trade Organization, 140 or 151 members, I believe. I lost count. And TPP is big, 30% of world trade, but there's the other 70%. And typically these regional trade pacts are distorting. The out guys are, even if better in cost and performance, are not trading because they're not in the club. So what about that argument against this mega regional trade agreement? Do you think that there'll be more and more of these that will be replaced de facto in the end? Or are you worried about the distortion of regional trade agreements?
Well, let me leap in and say that we published a study, and it's on our website, titled From Drift to Deals, recommending an agenda for the WTO. Director General Acevedo spoke at the Peterson Institute last week, and along the lines of what Bob and Dan have said, and Bob was there and asked a very arresting question. He said, and he's a very able diplomat, he said, well, at Nairobi, the Nairobi Ministerial, that we will only get a couple of smaller agreements on information technology, and probably get some additional countries to agree on, to ratify the trade facilitation agreement. Those are both big in their way, but they're not the giant Doha. So I would like to see the WTO do a lot more. The practical reality right now is it's stalled. There's a basic fundamental disagreement between the big emerging countries and the advanced countries. It seems pretty hard to overcome. So the actual liberalization of the moment will be done in TPP. Hopefully, I would say, the WTO will pick itself off the ground as a negotiating instrument, not just as a dispute settlement instrument, but that remains to be seen.
If I can add, I mean, I think the WTO has had its day, or the GATT had its day. The WTO failed to successfully perpetuate a round, and I don't think we'll ever see a day where there's going to be those kinds of big multilateral rounds again. It's just impracticable. You've got 160 countries at disparate levels of development with pursuing different objectives, as Gary mentioned. I remember in 2003 in Cancun when the talks broke down, and just observing the jubilation on the faces of the Indian delegation and some of the African delegations, and saying, this isn't going to work again. I know we tried for another 5 years, but it just didn't seem possible. I clearly prefer all the rules to apply to everybody equally, and I do worry about trade diversion, and I worry about the cost of complying with different standards in these different agreements. And it's getting more and more complicated, and there are people trying to figure out how we can ultimately multilateralize these. But the WTO may have to change its charter so that it can vote, perhaps, to adopt best practices from some of these agreements. But I think it is imperative that we figure out a way to get everybody on board with that. And so when you're negotiating a multilateral round, you have to achieve consensus. If that's not working, you have to do what's good for your country, and so you pursue these agreements, and hey, this is working. So the imperative then is on the countries that are outside to figure out a way to get in. And I think this model is the only way, really, to move us forward.
Yes.
I think here on the Trade Council DU delegation, I have a question for Gary or for anybody else who has views on that. In your list of issues, you didn't mention the provisions for entry into force of the agreement. I'm quite interested in it because business would like it to be enforced as soon as possible, but you need to ensure passage in a lot of countries. And you could think of different models, majority of members, you could think about percentage of GDP of all TPP members. So wondering if you have information on what it may be or views of how this should work because of entry into force.
I'll give a guess, and then Bob can draw on his photographic memory. I think it'll be a two-part test. One, a certain number of countries, and two, a certain percentage of trade. Like 8 countries, 70% of trade. I don't know.
What am I supposed to remember?
The conditions for entry into force in terms of ratification.
It's very complicated. First of all, everything gets frozen, and then there's a exchange of instruments. Everything gets frozen, then there's an exchange of instruments, of agreements. And when everybody accepts that everybody else's agreement is right on, then the states can implement the agreement, and that's when the president gets to say, okay, we're going to implement the STAM agreement, but it's only after everything gets checked out. It's a very complicated process, and that's even after the investigations that have to be made by the U.S. International Trade Commission and the reports and the this and the thises and the that's that go along with the 100 days. I mean, it gets to be very complicated. Maybe I haven't helped you at all.
Does the U.S. have to certify
Yes.
that each government's?
Yeah, we certify.
Okay, so that
The
is
certification.
also kind of objectionable to some.
Yes.
Thank you very much for the great overview. Eva Hampel from the U.S. Council for International Business. I work on trade and investment policy. One of the issues that is still outstanding that you haven't addressed is currency. Given the discussion we had in the context of TPA and everything, it doesn't seem like that's something that's resolved, but it's also never listed as one of the big complication issues that are still out there. So I'm just curious what your view is on that and the possible implications in terms of what it could say.
You're the currency man.
Well, this is not going to be covered in the TPP. I know that's an objective. So when I say it's not going to be covered, there may be some language that's very soft, and countries say, yeah, they're going to do their best and so forth. If there's any harder agreement, it will be, I think, a series of bilateral agreements between the Treasury and comparable finance ministries abroad, and maybe Secretary Liu will come up and say, look, these are the commitments and they've been made. But as a practical matter, I know it's one of the objectives. As a practical matter, you are not going to get countries to subject their currency practices to what I go back to this dispute settlement, to meaningful arbitration or meaningful dispute settlement. But maybe some kind of consultation, yeah, that will happen. So that won't satisfy the people who really wanted a hard currency provision in the TPP. That's my guess.
If I can add to that, the hard provisions didn't make it into the TPA language, but this alternative, made it. The Schumer bill made it into the customs law legislation, which may or may not be considered. The Schumer provision is much better from my perspective, in the sense that it's just commanding the Commerce Department to treat undervalued currencies as a subsidy. I think that's a long process of Commerce figuring out how to do that, how to measure it. There will be challenges in the WTO. So if that's the way to go, it's better than what Gary's colleagues were proposing, I think. Not everybody at Gary's shop agree with what their colleagues were proposing. I'll have you know that too. Their idea was, let's not identify specific instances of currency manipulation, but let's create the conditions that, definition of conditions that if they exist, you can infer that they're engaging in currency manipulation. And it was, you have more than enough currency reserves to cover 6 months of imports, your imports are rising, and you have a trade surplus. So something along those lines. Anyway, it was crafted in such a way, sort of in response to, well, what about QE2 and causing the U.S. dollar to decline, trying to insulate the United States from ever falling into that category. And Gary, you mentioned with the procurement terms, the U.S. trying to write these procurement terms in a way that maybe doesn't include them, wouldn't ensnare the U.S. That's what's happening with currency. So it wasn't a very good idea, in my opinion, and so I'm glad it's gone. But there's still interest. I mean, you still see the letters, but I don't know that it's going to materialize. You see letters from people interested in it.
This issue strikes at the core, at the heart of the nervous system, whatever. I'm trying to find the right expression of the Federal Reserve and the banking system in this country and the Treasury. They do not want any external authority telling them that they're doing the wrong thing, no matter what it is. It's part of the TTIP. They won't allow financial services to be negotiated as part of the TTIP because it could mean weakening Dodd-Frank, or it could mean some provision that would impair somehow the jurisdiction of the Fed. So it's just extraordinarily sensitive, and that's why it's taken so long for Treasury to get even to the place where they're willing to say, apparently participating in writing some language of the kind that you mentioned. Whether that will be good enough for the proponents in Congress, it probably won't be, but it's really sensitive. So I'm going to ask a question, if I may. That is, have we reached too far? Is this thing just too plain ambitious? Too many countries, too many subjects. It's just amazing, and I think if our negotiators can pull it off, they deserve Nobels or something, because it has become so complex. And I'm thinking that we've made a very hard job for them, and they can bring home some bacon. That would be great, but I can easily understand why that won't be possible. So do you think we should have toned it down?
Well, if we want quicker results, yes. But on the one hand, it's necessary to go further because globalization means that there's all this cross-border investment, there's transnational supply chains. Protectionism doesn't just lurk at the borders anymore. It lurks within regulations and within laws, and so there are places. If a German company used to just drop off its cargo at the port of Baltimore, and it was done. Now you've got the German affiliate doing the importing and having to deal with U.S. laws, and the way a law or regulation is structured could be discriminatory. So I think it's important that we think about those things and that we try to reduce disparities, because we want business to be able to have economies of scale, to be able to produce continuously for all markets instead of having to break it up by market, which increases cost of production and reduces the benefits of trade. So, but we don't want global government. So we each want to shape these rules in our own way. So it's a conundrum. There's no doubt.
Well, my one comment on this issue of overambition and so forth is that if you read, and I'm sure everybody here has, Congressman Levin's memo, I mean, you go issue by issue, and he's got about 8 or 9 issues there. He would want more. I mean, this is a person who has not been enthusiastic about the TPP from the get-go, but his criticisms, issue by issue, would ask for still greater ambition. So there's kind of a paradox there.
Good point.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Corey Olshansky with the Embassy of Canada. Speaking of getting it done and finishing it, what happens, let's say good news happens in Atlanta and we finish this. How does it work getting it through the American legislature? Getting it approved here?
No. It's really complicated. I mean, it has to be submitted to the Ways and Means Committee. There are much better people around than I who've written in detail about how this happens, but it requires a special process of congressional review that is called, as you may know, the TPA, Trade Promotion Authority, and it allows the Congress 100 days or something to examine it, and it makes it possible for a resolution of disapproval to be entered, and but not of disapproval of the whole agreement, but not modification of the agreement. So that's the whole idea behind TPA, that it simplified the process and took away the ability of the House and the Senate to amend the hell out of it. That's about as far as it's really complicated. And the Library of Congress has got a summary of how this works. And believe me, it's tricky.
Right, no, sorry. I mean, I understand the TPA process. I'm just concerned, or I wonder what your thoughts are and whether or not.
What?
About the prospects, you mean?
Yeah.
Oh, the
prospects
prospects.
are, yeah.
Sorry.
I didn't say no.
I'm not going to go there. You can.
I mean, if they got the same support that they got for TPA, I guess the deal it would be done, right? It depends on what's in this deal. So I'm worried about the tobacco carve out, the divorce of tobacco from ISDS, because there are people who are concerned that once you start discriminating against particular industries, it's a slippery slope. The next. First of all, Senator McConnell is from a tobacco state, and I think his support is needed to get this thing through.
Mm-hmm.
And then there are others who have industries that are sin industries, whether it's alcohol or fatty food production or sugary drink production, who think they might be next. And so I'm concerned about that. I don't know that there's going to be much of a change in whether in Democratic support or not. I could see more Republicans who wanted to vote against giving the president trade promotion authority on either constitutional grounds or just spite, coming around to saying, well, I have to support a free trade agreement. And Ted Cruz, for example, he's running for president, and if he's the nominee, I can't see the Republican nominee opposing the TPP. So he'll have to come back. So I think it's doable in Congress unless something egregious materializes in the next few days.
What do you think?
I think you guys are all very wise in not making a prediction, so I'll stick with that.
Does it depend on the content at the end of the day?
No, it doesn't. It does not depend on the content.
Wow.
Then what are they grappling about?
I mean, there's enough known about the content that if there's an issue that a particular congressman really doesn't like or really likes, he or she knows it already. So it's the general view, I think, on how trade interacts with the economy and inequality and kind of all these particularly employment issues. And there may be some issues, but they're all well known. For example, is the fact that Malaysia discriminates against Chinese or engages in human trafficking. Well, we know that already. So if that's a killer for you, it's nothing in the 700 pages is going to change that.
Brad, you've got a guy back there.
Yes.
Gordon Larson with Congressman Chris Stewart's office. So I appreciate Dan's comments on Cato's process for going through chapter by chapter and then sort of an overall grade. And those of us who work on the Hill will have to do a similar process, sort of going through and explaining to those in our districts that yes, we made some concessions on the timeline of biologics, for example, or whatever it might be, but here's why it's still a good deal overall. And I wonder if any of you can kind of elaborate on your suggestions for how the best ways to frame that. Yes, you're right, we did get it wrong on some of these things, or we didn't get what we wanted, but, you know, here's what we did get. What are the top 2 or 3 things that you would point to, the benefits that outweigh the costs, I guess?
I would just say, don't make the perfect the enemy of the good, and take what you get. I guess it depends on what district you're in.
Sure.
You know, so you find the likely benefits. There are plenty of trade associations around Washington that are showing the likely benefits of a TPP. You know, that's a political process. I don't know how it rings true to the ultimate analysis, but
So maybe I should phrase this a little better and say, you know, because you pointed to some of the, you alluded to some of the chapters that you say your guess is that they won't be as satisfactory as you want. Others you say, you know, are kind of what we want. If
Right.
you're looking at this holistically,
Yeah.
not parochially,
Sure.
as the parochial issue, what are the, you know, handful of chapters you would say we won, the U.S. won on this?
Well, we expanded our markets for services. Now, a lot of people don't understand the importance of services. One of the people who does most understand is right there, Brad Jensen. It is hugely important to the U.S. They are hugely important to the U.S. economy. We're the world's biggest exporter. It counts for a very large amount of our employment. And services have been left out in a way well, certainly of the WTO, the Doha Round. This agreement fully acknowledges the importance of services, opens up telecommunications investment, and probably more importantly, for the first time, establishes a regime that is friendly, a global legal structure. Well, it's not global. A legal structure that is friendly to electronic commerce and to personal privacy. The right to personal privacy is guaranteed in this. Other details like whether you have to locate a server in Brunei and in Vietnam, and you know, those obligations are taken away, are removed. Countries can't do that. So in a general way, I think you could make a very good case that the contemporary economy, the economy, is going to benefit from this agreement massively, and because it takes care of it deals with some very difficult problems. Did I mention personal privacy? Yeah. So I guess that's where I'd start, and the other is trade generation. You know, this is the master right here at studying these agreements and coming out and saying it's worth $2 billion more of, all those reports you've written on Korea.
Well, if I could just add to what Dan and Bob have said, just a little bit. I mean, as I say, we do have the global numbers on our website, but I am the first to say that people glaze over. Most people cannot distinguish, and it's a very common error, between 10 million and 10 billion. I mean, people don't relate to numbers of that magnitude, amount of exports or whatever. So that's not going to persuade. But those are those kind of assessments we do, I think, are the closest to, you could say, a holistic or global view. Now, more practically, therefore, since I don't think those are big sellers, I would identify the companies in the district or the state, which are big, relatively big employers, but maybe some small employers, and see if any of them see any benefits in the agreement for what they sell, or indeed what they buy, because they may get better, cheaper, better quality, whatever, access to inputs. And that includes Walmart and Target, as well as industrial firms which are using inputs to produce. And so if you can get a few companies to, say how it might affect them, including small companies that are selling by e-commerce, that would be, to me, what would probably speak to most voters.
Yeah, and the business community is very familiar with this process of bringing in business. Bringing in small groups of small businessmen, groups of big businessmen, and doing bell ringing, we call it bell ringing, or door knocks. And they go from office to office, from committee to committee, and make the case that right there, you know, the guy from Toulouse is actually going to be able to sell more saddles because of it.
So I don't know that this will help you sell it to your constituents, but I feel obligated to try to sell it to you all in this room. I think too often when we talk about trade agreements, we focus on the export side. It's a very mercantilistic mindset that I think we all fall into when we think about trade agreements. And much of the analysis that the government does on this, that the think tanks do, that even academics do, is focused on exporters. Exporters are better, they're bigger, they pay better wages. All of these kinds of stylized facts about how we want to help exporters. I'm guilty. I've produced some of those first numbers on how exporters are different. But what people don't realize, so there's this message that exports are good. And what's left unsaid is that somehow imports are bad. And what I'd like to try to persuade at least you all in this room is that exports are good, but imports are good too. If we look at importers, firms that import, they have all the desirable characteristics of firms that export.
Oh.
They're bigger, they're more productive, they pay higher wages. Okay, what we want to do is enable everyone to do what they're best at. We don't want to compel anyone to buy intermediate inputs to their process, whether it be a manufacturing process or a service process. We don't want to compel anyone to buy substandard inputs. If they can find better inputs somewhere else, they should be allowed to buy them somewhere else without a regulation or a duty or a tariff interfering. So what these agreements are about is enabling everyone, whether it be American business people or Canadian business people or Mexican business people or Japanese, to do what they do best with the least impediments. So I'm sorry for the long-winded abuse of my moderator privilege. But I think that has to be part of the conversation. And I think we too often found it, you know, this is going to create so many jobs. And it's like, no, trade agreements don't create jobs. They let us be more efficient. And when we fall into that crutch, it does damage, I think, to the whole enterprise. So pardon the abuse of my privilege. Yes.
Howdy, Eric Yan. I'm in corporate strategy for Audi of America. My question is regarding obviously the automotive industry and automotive manufacturing. Automotive manufacturing is tended to be more of a strategic industry given all the skill sets needed, the tooling, and the whole associated industries along with that. How do you see automotive manufacturing in the United States evolving if TPP is passed or also if TTIP is passed?
Well, I'm actually quite optimistic about the automotive industry in this country. And I know that it's an industry, or you know, the unions and the parts manufacturers are quite concerned about TPP. They're basically more alarmed than they're in favor of it. But I don't think they see their long-term interests in this current battle over the rules of origin, where some parts manufacturers want us to stick to the NAFTA rule, which very broadly was a 62.5% rule, and not liberalize that. And some Mexican and some Canadian producers are more or less in the same boat. I think that's a battle that it'll be fought, it'll be resolved some way, but I don't think that's critical. What the strength of the automotive industry in this country strengths are, is first of all, we can take advantage of the very different skill and cost conditions in Mexico and Canada than the United States. So you get this Adam Smith specialization to a fare thee well in this industry, which is highly integrated between these three countries. In addition, this is an industry which will be rapidly going to 3D manufacturing. And it already has been an industry where the ratio of employees to output has dropped quite rapidly.
Mhm.
The reason employment is down in autos is not that we're not selling them and making them, it's that the efficiency, productivity is very high in this industry, unlike, you could say, the overall economy, the productivity growth. And I think we're on the cusp of a whole new wave of productivity growth through 3D and distant manufacturing, which we will, I think, with our computer skills and labor skills and so forth, take rapid advantage of, so that the fact that, in 10 years from now, wages in the U.S. may be several times what they are in Thailand or China or wherever, that won't matter, because it'll be so computerized and automated and so on that it's how effective you are in that technology which will be the competitive strength. So I'm seeing quite a bright future for the auto industry, which I know is contrary to much current thinking.
And I think, Gary, what you mean by the auto industry having a bright future, you're not talking about the big three. You're talking about the auto industry, right? So we're talking about reasons to invest in the United States and reasons for more investment from Japanese nameplates and European nameplates, or Tesla. It's funny. U.S. auto policy is driven by GM, Ford, and Chrysler. GM makes more cars in China than the U.S. Ford has more production facilities outside of the United States than in, and Chrysler's an Italian company. But we have these Japanese and European nameplates that are here, adding lots of value to the U.S. economy, employing a lot of people, and the rules of origin that was mentioned. We were on the verge of messing it up a little bit with just the United States having a bilateral conversation with Japan about rules of origin and then leaving out Mexico and Canada from that conversation. That's our supply chain. And it's even perhaps more prominent in the TTIP negotiations. Canada's already completed a deal with Europe, and we are going to negotiate those same rules of origin with Europe without having Canada and Mexico involved. It seems to me that we should be thinking a little bit more clearly about that.
Follow-up question, just a quick follow-up question. If there's good news for TPP, how long do you expect for it to implement it? In other words, when will we see the tariffs start changing? Obviously a very difficult question, though.
It'll be a very long phase out. First of all, the tariff, the general tariff is the U.S. tariff is quite low, and Canadian and Mexican, most favored nation tariffs are higher. But at least for the U.S., given this anxiety for the general 2% or so tariff on assembled autos and auto parts, that will be probably a decade, my guess, to phase out, which is surprising, but there it is. But then there's the chicken war tariffs on SUVs at 25%, and that will go away, but my current guess is that won't go away for 20 years. However, Toyota and other firms, they produce their SUVs right here in the U.S. So the actual impact might be, modest, but it's regrettable it takes so long to phase it out.
Okay, great. Any other questions? Yes.
Thanks. I'm Joanne Thornton. I'm with Policy Connections International. Great discussion. Thanks all. But I'm going to go back to Gary Hufbauer's notion that this is an inflection point in the national debate over policy liberalization and globalization. And so what's the fallout on the broader agenda, the broader trade agenda, and the broader economic agenda if Congress fails to ratify the TPP? And I'm assuming the negotiations will close at some point soon, whether it's this week or in the next several months, and that the implementing process is actually going to be more difficult than closing the negotiation. It'll be a hard fight. So if it fails, what's the fallout on TTIP, on TISA, on ITA, on the green goods agreement at the WTO? All of those things, I suppose, if TPP fails, they loom all the larger as ways to move forward. On the other hand, will the debate have been decided against doing anything more?
Well, I'm a domino man. I think if it falls, they all fall. Or they're all postponed, at least for the next administration. I don't think the next administration is going to put in the effort that President Obama has put in against that background. Why beat your head against something which he put a lot of effort in and couldn't bring it off? So his political advisors will say, do something different, and probably that's what he or she will do. And so I think you're waiting until 2020 to see a possible revival, and it might be a very different world at that point.
I agree with that. It would be devastating if it couldn't pass.
I'll engage in just a little bit of heresy, as I sometimes do, and say,
Bring the stake.
no, I agree that the rug will be pulled out from any of these negotiations. Who's going to want to negotiate with the U.S. and what president is going to want to carry that mantle? But what I've been trying to argue for a few years is that
Dan, Mike.
Oh, I'm sorry. What I've been trying to argue for a few years is that really global economics, it's not about securing export markets, and I appreciate Brad's comments on imports. We try to make that all the time, but it's about competing for investment in your own country. And so what is that? What are the implications of that? You know, investment flows to regions that have good policies. You know, you have the rule of law, you have regulations that are reasonable, you have low taxes, you have good infrastructure and highly skilled workers. That, without the vehicle of formal trade negotiations to guide the economy forward, it'll be in every government's own interest to open up and to be as frictionless as possible to attract that investment. So, I mean, I think that's my vision for sort of unilateral liberalization. It is about engaging in domestic reforms to make your economy competitive. Government policies, because of globalization, are on trial. Capital's mobile. You can invest, and if you don't like the policies there, if you have a 35% corporate tax rate, and well, I'm going to keep my investment elsewhere. So that's one of the reasons I have a problem with ISDS too, because I think that subsidizes outsourcing from the United States. And I think it encourages others to invest elsewhere than in the United States. I don't have a problem with outsourcing, but I don't want the government to tax outsourcing, but I certainly don't want them to subsidize it either. So I just think that these other vehicles could become more viable.
Okay.
Any other questions? Oh, well, let me, on behalf of the audience, thank the panel for tremendous discussion. And let me thank you on behalf of the Georgetown Center for attending, and we'll look forward to seeing you again in the future. Meeting adjourned.